Well, thank you for joining us. I'm Simon Calvert, Deputy Director of the Christian Institute. We're delighted to be jointly hosting this online event today with the Affinity network of churches. Their director, Nicholls, who's also the pastor of Christ Church in Haywards Heath, is with us here in the studio today. He'll be chairing our question time later. Also with us in the studio is Mike Judge. Mike is the pastor of Chorlton Evangelical Church and the editor of Evangelical Times, and also a trustee of the Christian Institute. We're each going to speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes to take your questions. So please use the comment function to put your questions. Do this as we go along, please, so that we've got some time to process your questions before we get to them in about half an hour. Well, the Westminster Government has pledged to bring forward a draft conversion therapy bill. The bill will cover England and Wales. Scotland has asked for the legislation to extend to them, and in Northern Ireland, the government is considering whether to bring forward its own plans. But there is simply no way to legislate without damaging gospel freedom. Conversion is at the heart of the gospel message, so it's worrying that the government has chosen this word to describe the thing they want to criminalise. And the track record of governments in failing to recognise the importance of gospel freedom means that we've got every right to be concerned. Well, in a minute, Graham is going to talk about how these proposals could impact churches and families, and Mike is going to talk about how we engage with this and try and persuade people of our concerns. I just want to start by briefly setting the scene. And the main problem here is a problem of definition. No one knows what conversion therapy means. If it means abuse, then that's already illegal. Christians oppose it. But if conversion therapy means harmless conversations that reflect Christian beliefs or the reality of biological sex, then those conversations are perfectly legitimate. They are protected by human rights law, and they cannot and must not be criminalised. Well, the closest I can offer to a definition of conversion therapy is trying to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. That kind of phrasing comes up a lot from the activists. But again, what does it mean? Are you trying to change someone's gender identity if you refuse to use their preferred pronouns? Some activists think it is. Now, it's important to emphasise that we are not trying to defend unchristian behaviour towards gay or trans people. An existing law protects all people from verbal and physical abuse, and Christians uphold those laws and oppose mistreatment in the name of the Saviour who told us to love our neighbour. But campaigners insist on putting practices that are clearly abusive, like electroshock therapy on a gay person, into the same category as praying with a gay person or talking with a gay person about the Christian faith. It's not abuse they want to outlaw, it's opinions. Now, they tell us that there's evidence to back their campaign, but their research is poor and their claims often fall apart under scrutiny. And the very idea that gay and trans people are being abused in Britain today in a way that the criminal law can do nothing about, that's just not credible. Well, the Conservative government spent 6 years trying to come up with workable legislation on conversion therapy. We engaged with them throughout. They were very committed to it. But by the time of the general election last year, they were saying this. They said legislation around conversion practices is a very complex issue. That's clearly true. They said existing criminal law already offers robust protections. Again, that's right. They said that the challenges involved can be seen, for example, with Sweden recently concluding they will not be pursuing a similar ban. And then they said in the light of the Cass review, you remember that was the report into the treatment of gender questioning children, they said it's right that we take more time before reaching a final judgment on additional legislation in this area. Well, that's a big climb down, forced on them by the realities, the challenges of legislating in this space. Before the election, backbenchers in the Lords and in the Commons tried to bring in private members' bills on conversion therapy, but thankfully MPs and peers from across the parties demolished those proposals. The Scottish Government spent several years working on this, and they got as far as producing a draft bill. And they said it would protect parents' and pastors' freedoms, but it didn't. Their plans were a disaster, and we exposed this, and we threatened judicial review, and there was a chorus of criticism. They pulled back from their proposals, and they announced that they wanted Westminster to legislate for Scotland on this. And they told LGBT activists within their party that the reason they backed down, or one of the reasons at least, was to avoid judicial review. There have been at least 14 legal opinions from King's Counsel, leading King's Counsel, 10 of them commissioned by us, and they concluded that a conversion therapy law is likely to breach Articles 8, 9, 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The Netherlands has been trying for years to bring in a ban, and it's so far failed. Sweden has failed. Ireland has failed. If you join the Christian Institute email list, and there should be an address along the bottom of your screen now where you can do that, if you go to our website and join our email list, we will send you a copy of our new booklet called Proving Tricky. And this details the delay and the difficulty that governments around the world have faced when they've tried to bring in the kind of conversion therapy law that activists are demanding. I met with the Equalities Minister at Westminster and her officials about 2 weeks ago, and I took our lawyers along. It was a constructive meeting, and I give credit to the Minister for listening to us and for wanting to protect innocent conversations from being criminalised by her proposals. But it's an impossible task. It's a circle that cannot be squared. With long experience of governments acknowledging free speech and religious liberty concerns, but then, often inadvertently, pushing forward with proposals which trample on those freedoms anyway. But I want to tell you that I'm grateful to God for the many conversations that I've had over the last 6 years with Christian people and non-Christians who have grasped the reality, the danger of what a legislative conversion therapy ban could mean. So this is a winnable argument. But we all have to do our part if we're going to stop legislation like this coming in. And Mike's going to say more about that in a minute, but first Graham is going to talk about how a conversion therapy law could affect the ordinary work of churches and family life. And don't forget to post your questions in the comments.
Very grateful to be involved today. I am Director of Affinity, and there will be on the screen some information on how to connect with us. I want to spend a few minutes thinking about how such a conversion therapy law that Simon has spoken a little bit about, and thinking about experience around the world, how that would affect what normal, ordinary Christians do as part of church life and what parents do as part of home life. I'm not speaking as an expert on politics or expert on the law, but as a pastor and as a parent, and I am deeply concerned. The precise wording of the law, of course, is still being consulted on and still to be drafted, but we think pretty much we know what the shape of that law will be. That the definition of the bad thing being banned, or the bad things being banned, are practices with the ultimate aim to change or suppress someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, if you think about that statement, you don't need to think very far to think this could be interpreted in various ways, but all of them likely to affect you, brothers and sisters, what you're called to do, what you expect to be able to do, and up until now you've had freedom to do. So we really want to get the message across that this will affect ordinary pastors in big churches, in small churches. It will affect everyday parenting from Christian parents chatting with their children, and it will affect normal youth work. There have, as Simon's mentioned, been assurances that this is not going to affect freedom to express our religious beliefs, but this is logically incoherent, and as Simon's already said, impossible to think how that would actually work in practice. There is likely to be a ban on being directive. But by definition, in fact, most religions, but especially Christianity, is both a set of beliefs, but also a call on people to follow Jesus in what he says and indeed what he did. It's of course expressing both the truth and the implications. A truth might be Jesus died for sinners. The implication would be you need to repent and believe. And it's impossible for us as Christians to separate those things as though there's some abstract set of beliefs that we hold out here, but we never talk about them or try and encourage people to believe them or practice them. So just think for a moment about a Christian parent. You're a parent. Your 12-year-old daughter says she's been given a talk about gender at school, and she now thinks she is a man in a woman's body. You tell her, I understand it can be confusing as we grow up, and actually many women like doing stereotypically manly things, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you are a man. You don't need to pretend you're actually a man. Of course, we will love and support you in your choices as you grow up and go into adulthood. But as your parents right now, we cannot allow you to do anything that would describe yourself or dress yourself or present yourself in a way that is confusing to you and to the people around you and is harmful ultimately. Now, is that going to be a banned conversion practice? Could well be. And what happens if they tell their teachers what you said? Think again, what if you're an experienced pastor and a young man comes to you expressing that he's romantically and sexually attracted to men? He's a member of your church. You meet up with him a few times to chat a bit more about that. You always express great sympathy and understanding of the challenges that he's facing. You can see the obvious and painful struggle that he's going through, trying to reconcile what he believes and what he's been taught with what the Bible teaches. And you pray with him about it, and you encourage him to live in a way that's faithful to the teaching of the Bible, which, yes, for him might actually mean singleness if his feelings don't change. And you talk through that, and you care so deeply for him. But he doesn't listen to your advice. And he starts an intimate relationship with another guy. And very quickly, he's talking about becoming a married couple with that guy in law. And with great sadness, you have to tell him you're ignoring willfully the commands of Christ. And you plead with him to change. And you offer all kinds of support. And you exercise great patience and sympathy. And you don't rush at doing anything. But in the end, the whole church must conclude that this person could no longer be a member of that church. Will the new law find you guilty of conversion practices? It might. You're a youth leader, and one of your group, a late teenager, says they're actually bisexual. They don't want to restrict themselves to one gender, and actually they've already started having sex with both men and women their age. It's not against the law. But they realise it's wrong for them to be having sex outside of marriage with either a man or a woman, and they're moving towards thinking they should only marry the opposite sex. And they ask you for prayer and support. And you set up a small group of close and trusted friends who will pray with that person. They're going to pray that God would help them to fight their desire, to be faithful to Him, not to act on their feelings of attraction, and not to be sexually immoral. But sadly, later they change their minds and they think about reporting you to the police for the pressure they felt in those prayer groups. Is that going to be illegal? It might be. On Sunday, you're preaching about how we're all broken people and how we sin in many ways because our desires are bent out of shape. This shows itself in many ways, in lust, in greed, in slander, in disobedience, and sometimes in sexual immorality. And you call people to repent, and you call them to joyfully trust in Jesus, to save them and keep them. And that sermon is published online. And you just wonder whether you'll get a knock on the door from the police accusing you of both a hate crime and breaking this new conversion therapy ban. You wonder if your neighbours will watch you being driven away in one of those instantly recognisable cars. If the experiences around the world are anything to go by where they've had conversion therapy laws, all those things I listed could be against the law. So we want you to be aware so you can pray and act. In the end, we recognise God's sovereignty, don't we? We realise that sometimes the church does go through periods of pain and persecution and suffering. and we want to be faithful whatever the cost, whatever the law change that happens. But where we can, for the sake of the church, and actually for the sake of our neighbours, believers or not, we want to try and prevent such a damaging law. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Mike, who will talk about some ways that we could engage. Don't forget to use the comment section on YouTube to raise any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Graham. So you've just heard there how this proposed new law could affect parents and pastors. And I suppose the question we're all asking is, what can we do about it? And the answer is, there is much that we can do. And let me first of all encourage you by saying that in many other countries where they have tried to introduce this law, they've given up because they've discovered it's impossible to write a law which satisfies the radical activists who are demanding it without jeopardizing the free speech of parents, of pastors, and of medical professionals and a whole host of others. So there's all to play for. Let me just say that again. There really is all to play for. Our job, therefore, is to make sure that the government in Westminster is fully aware of our reasonable and justified concerns. We need to give them a more accurate understanding of how a ban on conversion therapy could affect ordinary parents and ordinary churches. Now, the radical activists, the ones who have been demanding this law, they've been telling all sorts of horror stories to the government. They've been making the government believe that Christian parents and pastors are engaging in cruel and unkind behaviours towards those who struggle with their sexual and gender identity. And you also have to remember that many people in Westminster and in Whitehall have got very little experience of ordinary church life and Christian family life. So when they hear these stories, they just accept them at face value. So therefore, we need to tell the government a more accurate story. We need to show the government that we do have reasonable and justified concerns about freedom of speech and religious liberty. We need to tell the government that whether we are parents in the home or whether we are pastors in the church, we do believe in the importance of offering pastoral care and guidance which lines up with our sincerely held beliefs about human identity and sexuality. Now, yet, sadly, if a ban does come in, it could be that even the most benign conversations or the most careful of prayers could be misconstrued as a crime. So we need to tell the politicians and the civil servants, and we need to make them know that for us as Christians, our faith shapes our understanding of human nature and human relationships and morality. And this includes belief about sexuality and gender. And often these beliefs can be countercultural. But the freedom to express those beliefs, whether it is through parenting, through preaching, through counseling, through personal conversation, that is a vital aspect of our religious freedom and our religious practice. However, a ban risks criminalizing such expressions, effectively prioritizing one set of beliefs as more important than another. Now, this is not a matter of us wanting to impose our religious beliefs on others. It's a question of us wanting to preserve the right to hold and to share those beliefs without fear of looking over our shoulder and wondering whether the police are going to come along. Now, the reality is there is no universal consensus on issues of sexuality and gender. Our culture is debating these things. Different cultures, different faiths, different communities hold a variety of perspectives, each informed by their own values and experiences. But a law that penalizes certain points of view effectively imposes a state-endorsed ideology and simply marginalizes those who take a different view. Now, that is a dangerous path, one that erodes freedom, that underpins our democratic society. Now, wanting to protect individuals from harm, that is a noble goal. And no one supports any abusive or coercive practices masquerading as therapy. But the proposed ban on conversion therapy, it risks going too far. It risks infringing on free speech and on religious liberty and on personal autonomy. And it creates an environment of fear and self-censorship where we start to be ultra careful about what we're allowed to say. And that undermines the very freedoms that allow an open and respectful dialogue. Now, we need to make the government aware of all these things. And yes, we need to be firm and unshakable when it comes to the truths that we believe, but we also need to be careful and reasonable in our tone. Remember, the other side of this debate want to paint a picture of us as dangerous and cruel oppressors who want to suppress the freedom of others. But in reality, the very opposite is true, for we are seeking to preserve people's freedom, the freedom to disagree, the freedom to express our own beliefs, the freedom to offer pastoral support on sexual and gender identity, even though that might be countercultural. So, in practical terms, what can we do? Well, here's one practical thing you can do, and that is to sign up to the Let Us Pray campaign. And that way, you will be kept up to date with news of where the proposals are at, and you'll also get help with how and when to contact politicians. Simply visit letuspray.uk and click the Join the Campaign button. Now, what else can you do? Well, you can certainly talk to other people about it. Many people are simply not aware of what is being proposed. Now, as I've said, we need to be sensible and reasonable in our tone. So you can help others in your church by using moderate language so that they can understand the threat to the gospel and the threat to loving parenting. And of course, we must make this a matter of prayer in our personal prayer devotions, but also in our church prayer meetings. And you can contact your MP. A short, friendly, considered letter or an email to your MP about your concerns, it can make a huge difference. For if an MP receives half a dozen such emails or letters, it sends a signal to that MP that this is an issue of real concern to his or her constituents. Better still, you can arrange to actually go and meet your MP in person. You can do that by yourself, or if you don't feel quite brave enough to do it alone, you can get a group of you from your church or either from a group of churches. Having a group of church leaders going to meet with a local MP can be tremendously helpful. Explain to your MP what your Christian ministry is about and what your concerns are. Perhaps then you can also engage with the legislative process when that time comes. Now, the government has still not yet published its draft bill, but when it does, we can expect that there will be a committee which will be tasked with scrutinising that draft bill, and then it will issue a public consultation, a public call for people to get involved in that process. Now, when that happens, it's crucial that the committee hears reasoned arguments from Christians about what is at stake. And you have to remember, most politicians do not really understand how ordinary churches and ordinary Christian families operate. So we need to persuade them, we need to show them in reasonable terms how a ban on conversion therapy will jeopardize our freedom of speech and our religious liberty. So yes, we must be firm and we must be clear in our beliefs, but also balanced and persuasive with our tone. And remember, if we make our case today, well, then the less trouble we might face tomorrow.
Well, thank you very much. We now have an opportunity for the remainder of our time to take some of your questions. Thank you for putting questions in the comments section. You can carry on doing that. There's well over 600 of you watching, and that's great. If we can't get your questions in these few minutes, we'll try and have a look at them and see if we can publish anything later that may address some of them. And do be aware that, of course, on YouTube, the recording will be available immediately, but also we will put it on the Affinity and the Christian Institute website, so you can have access to it there. So let's take some of those questions. What can we learn, which may be a little bit more positive, from the experience in Scotland? And connected with that, there was a question about how likely is the government to conclude that it's too difficult? So what can we learn from Scotland? How likely that government concludes it's too difficult?
Yeah. I mean, the experience in Scotland, as I was trying to say, is that they went all the way. They got, they had a committee of MPs report. They came out with 12 clauses of a bill. They had an 86-page consultation document. So they were going all out to introduce this. But when we got a leading King's Counsel to look at the proposals, he tore them to shreds. And this is the same King's Counsel that we used when we sued the Scottish Government several years ago over something else. And we won that legal action. So I think that would have concentrated minds in the Scottish Government. But it wasn't just us. You had lots of other groups speaking out. And people will have seen the headlines that were disastrously bad for the Scottish Government. So, fair play to the Scottish Government. They were sufficiently chastened by that to think, we can't press ahead with our own bill, at this time in this form. And so the lesson is that we mustn't give up.
Why do you think, though, that Annalise Dodds and the government are not reading that and thinking or drawing the same conclusion that you have? So,
I think firstly, it's one thing to be the government at the centre of that kind of pushback. And then another thing to be sort of in Westminster, sort of viewing it from a distance. Obviously we have drawn their attention to what happened and they're aware of it. I think the other thing is that I think they kind of do have to learn it for themselves in the same way that the Conservatives did. And so again, it's just important that we use every opportunity to push back. So, for example, when the private members' bills were proposed, some people sort of argued, we don't need to worry about them, they're never going to become law. But our concern was that this was going to advance the argument. So we made sure that we pushed back. We briefed there was a huge, alliance of people working together. And the result was that we smashed those bills and we kind of pushed back the cause. So this is one of those issues, like other issues that we work on, where the more people see of it, the less they like it. And the more time we have and the more scrutiny we have, the better.
Yeah, and if I might just add, yes. I think it also underlines the fact that you've got to keep on making the argument. You can't just make the argument once and then say, well, I've done that. I've done my best attempt to make the argument. You've got to keep making the argument because successive governments might come and say, oh, we can do this. The others have failed, but we can do it. Well, no. When you look at it more carefully, you realise you can't. But we've got to keep on making those arguments. But if we do, then the experience has shown us that people will drop these proposals.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Obviously, they have lots of other things to do in their lives as well. So we have a collective sort of memory and passion for these things, whereas if you're in government, I guess you're doing lots of other things as well. And so you come back to this at a high level and think, oh yes, this is a bad thing, we need to get rid of it, and haven't really thought deeply about it. A quick question for you, Mike. How realistic is it to meet up with your local MP? Have you had experience of that?
Yeah, I have had experience of engaging with my local MP. Yeah, MPs are busy people, but they do want to meet constituents. They really do. And some constituencies' surgeries are not very well attended. Yeah. And so you will find that your MP, particularly if you are a church leader, because they recognise that you're not just coming in your own capacity, you're representing a congregation of people. Yeah. If you're going as a group of church pastors together to go meet an MP, that can be really powerful. Yeah. MPs will be eager to meet with you and to listen to your concerns. So I would really encourage people to do that.
Definitely, thank you. Yeah, we have such a meeting coming up in a couple of weeks in my local area. Another question, has there been any talk of a robust free speech guard being inserted? And do people like Rowan Atkinson have a view? That was question 2.
Right. Well, yes, some people do talk about having a kind of a free speech safeguard in it, but frankly, if any conversion therapy law is going to be problematic, anything that enshrines this concept in law as a specific criminal offence is going to have a chilling effect. And if we are left having to rely on a free speech clause, then the risk is that if you don't tick all the boxes in that free speech clause, you won't benefit from it. So you be in a position where by default, the thing you say is criminal conversion therapy unless you fit within the terms of the free speech clause. I just don't like that idea. That, yes, that may be what we end up with at the end of this process. I hope not, but it may be. But that's a long way down the road. That's a risky process. Rowan Atkinson has not, to my knowledge, expressed a view on this. We worked with him in 2012, Mike, on the Reform Section 5 campaign. He gave a speech for us at the launch of that campaign in Parliament, which has gone viral online many times, been watched millions of times. So I don't know what Rowan Atkinson's view about a conversion therapy ban is, but I do know that he believes in protecting the free speech of people who disagree with him. So he will be a liberal, presumably. He will probably support kind of liberal causes, but he would want to defend our freedom to hold our view. And that, again, that is a conversation that I've had so many times with people that say, I don't agree with Christian views on sexual ethics and marriage, but I don't think you should be prosecuted for them. No. And that's all we want.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add is that it's not just Christians who are concerned about this. There are a number of secular celebrities and atheists who, again, as Simon says, they certainly don't share our Christian view of sexual ethics, but they don't believe that the criminal law should be imposing one side and destroying the free speech of others.
Yeah, and many parents who would be worried, whether they're Christian or not, about a conversation with their child where they may gently want to contradict the thing that the child's expressing, perhaps that they've picked up at school. Another question which I think is a great one, is this likely to be an ideological issue for the government rather than a reasonable discussion on law and logic?
Well, I suppose there are always those within government who are ideologically driven. And they're so ideologically driven that it's very difficult to have a reasonable discussion with them. However, there are also those in politics who are aware of the reality. And the reality is that if there are sufficient people who have got sufficient reasonable and legal concerns about this, the government will listen. Now, some of them will listen in a reasonable and open way. And perhaps you'll be bringing points of view that they'd not considered before, and they welcome you raising those points. Others, perhaps, through gritted teeth, will accept that what you're saying is the reality. So there are all sorts of different people in government. But we can, if the question is asking, is there any point making a reasoned argument to people who are ideologically committed to something, I would say, yes, there is still an argument in being reasonable and trying to persuade them, because the reality is they will have to sit down and legislate for this if they want to proceed, and they will find it incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah, I guess the ideological, theological question might be if someone is so convinced that to suggest that someone who wants to change their gender or who wants to practice homosexuality, to suggest that could be wrong is so abhorrent, it's kind of it's a no-brainer that should be banned, in the same way that terrible racist, hateful comments are banned. So I suppose if someone's so rooted in that, it's not so much a legal argument, it's saying it's obvious you shouldn't even say that. I don't think that's where the legislators are at, but that could be an argument to say it's not about free speech because what you're saying is so terribly bad.
Yeah, certainly there are activists who say that, but of course the other reality for government ministers and for civil servants is human rights law, which is why we've spent so much time and supporters' money obtaining advice from King's Counsel, and that has, as I said, has emphatically and repeatedly warned the government that any kind of legislation in this space is likely to breach human rights. And however committed or ideological or unreasonable somebody might be, that is a reality, and they have to kind of accept that reality, and they have to work around that.
Yeah, there is a question related to that, which is, at what point do we take it to the EHCR, European Court of Human Rights?
And at the end of the process. Yeah. I mean, we must make the case now. We must make the case now, and we must try and win the argument. As Mike said, there will be a draft bill, so there'll be a call for evidence, chance to put our case. Then there'll be, if the government proceeds with it, a proper bill, and there'll be all the legislative process in the Commons, chance to fight our case, all the legislative process in the Lords, and then only if it completes all of that will it become an Act of Parliament, and that's when we start thinking about litigation to try and block the legislation or shave off the sharp edges.
And if I might just jump in here, the other thing, thinking about the lengthy process, I mean, we are optimistic that we can persuade the government that they shouldn't be legislating in this, and that's our goal. But even if the government does decide to go ahead, the fact that we have raised certain scenarios, the fact that we have raised certain objections, if we can get the government to make certain commitments that it is not their intention to infringe those areas, that can be helpful down the line. Because if we do have a ban and guidance is introduced, we can point back to things that the government has said, and that can be tremendously helpful, and also with any future court cases that might be running on this. So for all these reasons, it's so important that Christians make the case.
Hopefully a really quick question. Is it likely to be a civil or criminal law?
Criminal.
Okay, good answer.
So civil means that you do something wrong and I sue you in the civil courts to try and get damages from you. But criminal means that I complain about you to the police come and talk to you, they arrest you, they charge you, they refer it to the Crown Prosecution Service, you go to a criminal
There's
court.
a higher bar
Yes.
burden of proof for criminal law. Yeah. A pastoral question, which may be related to the law as well. What if a gay or trans person takes the initiative and approaches us with a desire to seek biblical counsel? Surely this is respecting their own personal autonomy and wishes. I mean, that is the problem with the law, but do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a pastor of a church, and you think through these scenarios, and I'd say it depends, doesn't it? It depends whether this is this someone who's just arrived at the church and I don't know very well, or is this someone I've known for years? And do I sense that the person is coming to me in an attempt to trap me, in which case I might be a bit more guarded. Whereas if someone's coming with a genuine question, they're genuinely struggling, I want to offer pastoral care and sympathy while still holding to the church's position. So in many ways, you've got to use your pastoral common sense and try and understand who it is you're dealing with. But I think we need a great deal of wisdom, a great deal of discernment. And I would say that if any church pastor has such a conversation and is then a little bit anxious about it afterwards, you can always contact groups like the Christian Institute, be able to offer some good advice.
In terms of the law, do you think the law is likely to cover that? I think I read something that there was going to be more latitude for older people, adults, to make kind of an informed choice and say, I want to remain celibate or whatever, but not for children, is that?
Yes, so the Scottish proposals made that distinction, and I'm just looking to my colleague off camera, and I think the previous discussion in the Westminster Government, they were looking to make the same distinction. So yes, it will be an even more stringent law for under 18s. And again, that's very concerning because what does that mean for children's work? What does that mean for youth work? What does that mean for parents?
Absolutely.
And so, you get that they are trying to make the case that, well, we're trying to protect the more vulnerable, but I mean, we're very clear that we're not talking about defending the indefensible kind of behaviour, but B, having a stricter, more stringent law for children does mean that the most innocent, the most harmless, the most everyday kind of conversations that parents might have with kids or that youth leaders might have in church could result in somebody calling the police. And that's what we need to avoid.
A question about whether other religions, particularly Muslims and Jews are mentioned here, but should they be concerned and are they making efforts themselves, or should we make effort to approach them and have a united front with other religions?
So, Mike, I don't know if you can speak to this, but I mean, I've been working on this for years. That there are one or two representatives of some of the other faiths who have spoken out publicly. There are, I think, fair to say, kind of more individuals who are kind of, working on a kind of quiet level, having conversations and kind of sensibly making the case. So, yes, there is some shared concern, but I would say that in terms of kind of leading on this issue, you have the Christians, and I mean, groups like the Greater Love Declaration, Graham, that you're involved with, have also helped to kind of lead from the Christian side on conversion therapy. And then you have gender-critical feminists, sex realists. That's a constituency which is very concerned about this. And so, interestingly, for example, when Hilary Cass produced a report into the treatment of gender questioning kids in the NHS, when she was interviewed about it, she said, it's already really difficult for professionals talking to kids with the current sort of climate of hostility around not supporting trans. She said, so a conversion therapy law is bound to make that worse. She basically said, I can't see how you could legislate without making that worse. And so you have that concern coming from that constituency as well.
So will people be arguing the Cash report is actually helpful in fighting against the conversion therapy law?
I don't think a conversion therapy law is CAS compliant.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you. Does the experience from Australia help us at all?
Well, I think in the Australian state of Victoria, they've introduced a law that is extremely broad and extremely worrying. And I think that one of the things I found alarming was the guidance that was then issued after the law had been passed, where they effectively started telling churches and Christian parents what they could and couldn't say, what they could and couldn't pray, and the kind of prayers that will become illegal. Now, I think that's helpful to us in the sense that we can point to that. We can say, look, that is the logical progression of where this law is taking us.
Yeah.
But I think it's also interesting that at the moment in Victoria, the authorities have been nervous about implementing the law. And the reason they've been nervous is because Christians, prior to the law being passed, were objecting to it and were making reasoned objections to it. So that the authorities know that if they jump in immediately after the law has been passed and start prosecuting pastors, that will be difficult for them positionally and politically. And so they've held off. And what I would say to people is, for that reason alone, it's worth raising objections here in the UK, because it means that even if a law is passed, they're much less likely to implement it in a way that we might be concerned about. So there are all sorts of lessons that come from Australia.
There's a booklet that I think
there is a booklet
for people to see and find.
Yes, if people Google Conversion Therapy Gold Standard, that will give you the Christian Institute's booklet called Gold Standard, which is all about the Australian law that Mike mentioned.
Very good, thank you. There is a question which it probably also is answered elsewhere, but what sort of points should we make when meeting with our MP or writing to our MP?
Well, I mean, hopefully the kind of things that we've been talking about here today are giving people some idea about the way of talking about these things in a way that, the people can relate to. I think, as Mike was emphasising, understanding where they might be coming from, that they might be coming from a position where, they think there's something really kind of, you're doing something seriously wrong. You are starting from kind of 6 paces behind the start line, so you might just have to kind of sort of carefully navigate that. But I think just to say, that we're concerned about criminalising conversations. I think that's the way to get into this issue. Criminalising conversations, whether those conversations are religious or non-religious, just bringing the police and prosecutors into ordinary, harmless, gentle conversations around sex and sexuality. That's where our concerns are at, and that's the sort of thing that MPs should be concerned about.
And pointing out some of the incoherence that we've been talking about today, even the incoherence of the fact that by definition you're converting if you're trying to change your gender expression. So there's someone asked a question about, aren't you coercing someone to change their gender, and that's a conversion therapy bannable thing, which I don't think it will be, but I think that's the thing. Quick question, because we've got about a minute or so left. Could past conversations be illegal under the ban?
Well, can I just say this
conversations that happened before the ban came into
I
place.
see. Retrospective, no. Short answer to that is no. But just to say as well, in Australia, I think one of the reasons we haven't seen cases is there probably hasn't been the timeline, because typically the sort of person who's going to make a complaint is the sort of person that changes his mind 5 or 10 years down the line.
Can I also ask a question? I'll jump in here just very, very quickly. What about after, let's say, imagine a ban comes in and let's say there's a sermon on this topic, or that touches upon this topic, and then the sermon's out there recorded and on the internet. Is there a time limit on when they can raise concerns about that?
So I'm going to say sermons on the internet I am not really worried about, because the whole point of a conversion therapy ban is I am trying to change you and your sexual orientation. And if I just say this thing on YouTube, it's not directed at an individual.
No.
Well, that's really helpful, because pastors should still feel comfortable about proclaiming traditional Christian beliefs in their sermons going out there on the internet.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. of course, not to say you shouldn't be confident, but it may be used to indicate a trend, which then prompts further investigation. And in the end, we want to campaign and fight for this because we think it's bad, but also we trust God, and we know that He will help us whatever happens. So thank you, everybody, for listening. If you're listening live, a particular thank you to you. If you're listening on catch up, then you're most welcome too. Do engage with the issue. This webinar was for you, and it isn't just about a few key people who need to act, but all of us need to act on this and to encourage our churches to do the same. So keep looking out for further notices about this. Share this YouTube video as far and wide as you're able to, and encourage Christians to both pray and act as we've been encouraged to do. Thank you very much.
For more great content, like, subscribe and hit the notification bell.